Hello. Today we're going to be talking about consciousness and attention. We focus primarily on the role of conscious awareness in attention and questions of consciousness, including definitions of consciousness, talking about attention, the phenomenology of consciousness, the problem of other minds, and a little bit about the mind-body problem. Consciousness is a person's subjective experience of the world and the mind. So whenever we're talking about conscious awareness, it's simply things that we are consciously aware of, and it's our subjective experience of that. Of course, that includes things that we attend to, things that we are aware of. Of course, we're not aware of everything we experience or even everything we're able to do. Attention, then, is the process by which we direct our cognitive resources towards some environmental event in order to gather information about that event. This is the mechanism by which we process a subset of information from the virtually limitless amount of information in the environment. Attention is a particularly important process because if we processed everything coming at us, we would be quickly overwhelmed. So it's how we're able to select one voice out of a crowded room. That's how we're able to focus our attention on the road and ignore what's happening in the car or on the radio. It's a really important process. It's also an important survival process because we have automatic processes in attention where things will automatically capture our attention, particularly things that are moving quickly or sudden loud noises, anything that might be threatening to us. Phenomenology is how things seem to a conscious person. That is, that's our internal perspective. So when we talk about the phenomenological experience, we're talking about how someone's experiencing an event. So when we talk about the phenomenology of emotion, what does that feel like? What's it like from that person's perspective? What does it feel like to have a conscious recollection versus a sense that you might know something? That's a phenomenological question. One of the other issues of consciousness comes to the question of what we call the problem of other minds. And this is a difficulty all humans have in perceiving the consciousness of others. So people judge minds according to the capacity for experience and what we call agency. So to give you an idea of what this is like, we talk about people have a great deal of agency, and then we talk about infants and their experience, or previously alive human beings, dead human beings, robots, animals, toddlers. So toddlers have more experience but less agency than, say, a fetus, whereas a child has experience but less agency, whereas adults have lots of agency and lots of experience, versus dogs that have a lot of experience but less agency, etc. So it's simply a way in which we think about consciousness and others, and oftentimes how we do attribution. The final question under consciousness has to do with what we call the mind-body problem. This is the issue of how the mind is related to the brain and the body. Descartes was the one who originally proposed the idea of separate but interrelated mechanisms for mind and body that interacted at the pineal gland. That is, the seat of the soul was at the pineal gland, and this is the point where mind and body interacted. And so this idea of Cartesian dualism, that is, two mind and body being separate, was sort of the origination of this idea of mind and body being separate. We still really can't tell you whether or not mind and brain are one or are separate. We know that brain's activities may precede conscious activity. So there's some experiments that purport that we have no free will because we are acting before we have any conscious awareness. So the basic idea here is this: we have brain activity that begins, we have a conscious wish to act, and finger movement occurs. And what happens in these experiments is things start happening. You can see the brain activity begins far before we get the conscious wish to act. 300 milliseconds or so before we have a conscious will to act, the brain shows that things are happening. What we now know, though, is that recent evidence shows that we have control over these activities, that we can actually stop them when signaled. But what's happening when that brain activity starts is we're preparing to act because we know we're supposed to act. The next question that we have to talk about is the nature of consciousness, which really has to do with what we call controlled attention. Consciousness has four basic properties: intentionality, That is, when we direct towards, specifically towards an object, so we're intentionally directing our attention in some direction. That's where we focus on an object or focus on some aspect of an object. Unity relates to resistance to division. This is the question of divided attention. Divided attention is really a misnomer. We can rarely actually genuinely divide our attention. In general, what we really are doing is rapidly task switching. So divided attention is something that really doesn't exist. What we're doing is rapidly switching back and forth. And there's always a cost in that switch. It's called the task switching cost. So we always lose some ability as we're switching back and forth, or certainly there's a cost in reaction time. So it's the reason why talking on your phone and operating a motor vehicle is more dangerous, because you're switching back and forth between those tasks. Selectivity refers to the capacity to include some stimuli or aspects of a stimulus but not others. So this is our ability to select specific subsets from our environment. So not only can we intentionally direct, but we can also select a specific part from the environment. The earliest experiments in this area were conducted in what's called dichotic listening. This is a task in which people wearing headphones hear different messages presented to each ear. And this is what that looks like. So we have different messages being presented to each ear, and the participant's task is to shadow one ear. So we have the attended input here, which is the President Lincoln often read by the light of the fire, and that person repeats that back, and then they ignore what's happening in that other input. So this kind of dichotic listening gives us something to pay attention to, something to ignore, and it can tell us how this attentional mechanism is working by seeing what we can and cannot report about that ignored input. So what Cherry and others found about attention in these tasks is we're pretty good at ignoring that other message. In fact, we can't tell anything about what's happening except for maybe whether or not it was speech or non-speech, whether it was a male or female voice, but that's about it. We call this ability to select one message over another the cocktail party phenomenon. That is, we tune into one message even while we filter out others nearby. It's the way we're able to have a conversation with one person in a crowded room. An interesting part about this is that if someone says our name, it will automatically capture our attention. So as soon as we hear someone say our name, we'll automatically capture our attention and we'll direct our attention in that way. It's one of those things that we call an enduring disposition. That is, we'll always focus our attention on it. There are some things that will automatically capture our attention. Crying babies are one of them. We are evolutionarily designed to attend to our offspring, and so we can't ignore a crying infant, which is why when we're on a plane with a crying infant, we find that so bothersome because we can't ignore it. We can ignore other things, but that we can't ignore. Another demonstration of this selectivity is what's called the Stroop effect, and there's this conflict between two brain processes in this effect: word recognition and color recognition. And that conflict requires extra processing time for the brain to resolve. So in this task, participants are told to report the color of a stimulus and ignore whatever else it might be. So in a control condition, you get something that looks like this. You go, red, green, red, blue, green, red, green, something like that. Very simple to do because it's very easy to just see those color swatches. This is the more important condition where you have to ignore the word and focus on the color. So here it would be red, blue, green, yellow, green, black, blue, red, yellow, black, etc. So you have to ignore the words purple, yellow, red, black, red, green, and focus on the colors themselves. So that ability to inhibit that word, which we automatically captures our attention, it requires a lot of effort to do that, is an important measure of our attentional abilities. In fact, the Stroop task is used oftentimes to measure executive functioning in older adults. Finally, our last basic property of consciousness is transience, which is the tendency to change. Things automatically capture our attention. We switch back and forth between stimuli, things that automatically capture our attention, etc. I want to turn now to talk about different levels of awareness, because we don't always fully attend to things in our environment. So consciousness ranges in levels from minimal consciousness to full consciousness to self-consciousness. So we'll start with minimal consciousness. This is a low-level kind of sensory awareness and responsiveness that occurs when the mind inputs sensations and may output behavior. So this is where we're talking about some sort of low-level, minimal consciousness, barely paying attention, copying down what somebody's saying, mimicking behavior, not really fully present, not fully paying attention. Full consciousness is when we're in a conscious state in which we know and are able to report our mental state. We're fully aware, we're fully present. So minimal consciousness might be when we're asleep or partially asleep or intoxicated. Full consciousness is when we know and are able to report our mental state, fully aware of that. Self-consciousness is a distinct level of consciousness in which the person's attention is drawn to ourself as an object. So we're paying attention to ourselves. In fact, when we talk about social psychology, we often talk about what we call self-monitoring. People who pay a lot of attention to where they are, whether or not they fit in, whether or not they're standing out, that sort of thing. And then this is one of those things that develops over time. So eventually we can recognize ourselves in mirrors, and that occurs through humans and other animals. So that self-consciousness is not entirely a human trait. Attention has both conscious and non-conscious components. Automatic processes are those which occur without conscious awareness, whereas controlled processes require our sustained conscious attention to accomplish. Now, processes can become automatic through practice. To give you an example, when you first start to drive a car, many of those things are controlled processes. You think about what to do, step on the brake, think about turning on your turn signal, how to turn the steering wheel. Eventually, you get to the point where you're paying no conscious awareness to those tasks, so you're able to accomplish them automatically, which is why when asked, did you signal at the last intersection, oftentimes we can't report that because we have no conscious awareness of having done so. We have a lot of things that we sort of do on autopilot, like you're in the shower, washing your hair. Everybody has at some point washed their hair twice because they don't remember whether or not they just did it, because we just proceed on autopilot so often in those kind of tasks. Other examples are, so we're learning a new skill, so we're trying to learn to play the piano. Eventually a lot of those things can become automatic, and so we don't have to consciously attend to every part of that particular skill. I want to take a side note here and talk about mind wandering. Our minds most often wander when we are engaged in automated repetitive tasks or in difficult or complex tasks. We may be unaware of our minds wandering. It's similar to being under the influence of alcohol. This is particularly dangerous while driving. Lots of people mind wander, and this is as dangerous as drinking and driving. I think probably some of you have had the experience being in a long car trip and you have suddenly no memory for the last 20 or 30 miles or 20 or 30 minutes because your mind has simply wandered that whole time and you have no idea what happened in the last 30 miles. Fortunately, nothing important happened, but it is something that is something to be mindful of. Finally, recent evidence shows that telling students there will be a quiz at the end of the class is actually associated with less mind wandering. They're able to focus more throughout class. Conscious contents is our next thing to quickly talk about. fMRI research on daydreaming shows a widespread pattern of activation known as the default network. So this is really important. We talk about the default network as being sort of what's happening when we're just sitting around, not focused on anything, we're just sort of letting our mind wander and do its own thing. It's in its default mode. This is something that's talked a lot about, where our default mode is just sort of in its most basic state. We're not consciously attending to things, we're not doing anything, we're just sort of in that default mode. We then take mental control. That is our attempt to change conscious states of mind, and this is what we think of as sort of free will, as consciousness, as awareness. There is an ironic process of mental control, and that mental processes can produce ironic errors because monitoring for our errors can itself produce them. And so it's sort of like trying to do thought suppression. When you get a song stuck in your head, you're sort of monitoring for that error, and then it keeps coming back and coming back and coming back. So that's where we get at this question of thought suppression. And this is the conscious avoidance of thought. And this is a mistake. You get this rebound effect of thought suppression. So what happens is the tendency of a thought to return to consciousness with greater frequency following suppression. So this is why telling people to just try to put it out of their mind or forget about it is a terrible idea. So if you just try to push things out of your mind, something unpleasant you don't want to think about, it will just come back with a vengeance later. Far better to distract rather than suppress. And so doing other things where you're just simply paying attention to other things will not cause this rebound effect. But trying to consciously suppress a thought, not think about it, is actually a mistake. Finally, I want to briefly talk about the unconscious mind. Of course, Sigmund Freud is the original sort of arbiter of the unconscious mind and all of its particular influences. Much of what Freud proposed has not borne fruit, as it were, in the scientific rigor, or under rigorous scientific scrutiny. But it's important to get a little historical perspective. The first thing Freud talked about is the dynamic unconscious, which is this active system encompassing our lifetime of hidden memories, our deepest instincts and desires, and our inner struggle to control those forces. So according to this Freudian Jungian idea, we have these unconscious forces that are controlling our behavior and causing us to do crazy or be crazy things. Freudian slips, which is actually one of my favorite bits of Freud's work, is when we say something inadvertent and it's thought to reveal an unconscious thought or desire. So you say something, not what you meant to say, but probably maybe what you were feeling or thinking. So it reveals something unconscious. And I think there's probably something to that. We've all had a little slip of the tongue, but we call that a Freudian slip. Freud also believed in repression, which is this mental process that removes unacceptable thoughts and memories from consciousness. There's no evidence for repression as a mechanism. Sometimes we just don't remember, or memories just aren't encoded in the first place. So recovering memories is certainly something that is probably never going to accomplish anything. So that's dynamic unconscious and repression. So in modern views of the unconscious, we have the cognitive unconscious, which are mental processes that give rise to a person's thoughts, choices, emotions, and behavior, even though they are not experienced by the person. These are automatic processes and implicit memory, so things that we do without conscious awareness. So riding a bike, we can do that without ever having any conscious awareness of having done so, or of all of the steps involved in that. So those are automatic processes. We also have implicit memories, where our recent events can alter our behavior in certain ways. Tied into this is this idea of subliminal perception, where a thought or behavior is influenced by stimuli that a person cannot consciously report perceiving. There's some controversy about this. Certainly back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, there was some question about whether or not flashing up a picture of a Coke on the screen would get people to get up and go buy drinks from the snack stand at a movie theater. It hasn't really borne out any evidence that there is anything there. Far more common are the unconscious influences of scent. So for example, movie theaters constantly pop popcorn, and they do that so that their lobbies constantly smell like popcorn, which is why you pay $27 for popcorn, because they throw away 10 buckets for every bucket they sell. Same thing when you go to the mall. Why do you think Cinnabon is always making cinnamon rolls? Because they want you to smell that, crave that, and then come buy something. In studies of subliminal perception, these are the kinds of things that can be done. You can present very rapidly what we call subliminally, so you don't actually get a conscious look at one of these two pictures. So obviously in the first picture we have devil child throwing a cake. In the second picture we have a nice child handing you birthday cake. So those are presented rapidly, very few milliseconds. Pattern mask is put over that so you can't still see anything. And then you're shown this picture, finally picture B, and you're asked to rate how much you like this person. People who are shown A1 like him less than people who are shown A2. So there's some evidence that you could have been colored by your recent experience. So there is some possibility to subliminal perception. Finally, unconscious processing can actually help or hurt decision making. So in studies on roommate preference, people who are asked to make an immediate decision versus a conscious decision versus an unconscious decision, that is, were asked not to think about it, to just select the one they thought was best. There's something to that kind of decision in terms of how it comes out. The Gestalt psychologists thought that incubation was an important part of decision making. That is, it's possible that there is some unconscious cognitive functions happening at that time. And then finally, stereotyping often occurs without conscious awareness. We'll talk about this later in the semester, but this is a really important issue in our modern questions of things like racial stereotyping and potential bias from employers, from Airbnb hosts, from police officers, because people don't know that they might have some sort of unconscious bias because of that stereotype. It's going to be really important for us to talk about later. Well, thanks. That was a very quick and brief introduction to consciousness and awareness.